It's a great pleasure to welcome back to National a good friend, Cherie Harder. She's president of the Trinity Forum. Many of you know and appreciate the ministry of the Trinity Forum. It has a unique and important ministry here in D.C. and increasingly around the world, as for the past 3 years they have been having, in addition to their Tuesday evening in-person evening conversations, not always on Tuesday evening, but it often is, Friday afternoon webinars that have a reach around the world. Some of our favorite speakers are also some of Trinity Forum's favorite speakers. Pete Weiner, Oz Guinness, David Brooks, to name a few. And every year, when I put together our lineup for this summer morning series, which many of you have told me, where do you get all these speakers? Well, I always talk to Cherie and say, who do you think? And get her wise counsel. Prior to joining the Trinity Forum in 2008, Cherie served in the White House as a special assistant to the president and director of policy and projects for First Lady Laura Bush. Early in her career, she was a policy advisor to Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist, who was a longtime member here at National. And from 2001 to 2005, she was senior counselor to the chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities, where she helped design and launch the We the People initiative to enhance the teaching, study, and understanding of American history. Cherie has contributed articles to several publications in various newspapers. Her ghostwritten speeches and articles have appeared in vital speeches of the day, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, USA Today, and others. But she is not a ghost this morning. We're so glad that she is here. She holds an honors PA, magna cum laude in government from Harvard University, a postgraduate diploma in literature from University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia, where she was a Rotary Scholar. She has served as a senior fellow at Cardis and has served on boards and is currently a member of the board, or an advisory board member of the National Museum of American Religion. This morning's politics: context, crisis, and hope. Faith in a post-quarantine world. We need your good word. Cherie, welcome.
Well, thank you, Quinn, for that warm introduction. It's a real pleasure to get to be with you all today. This is, I think, probably the third or fourth time to be back at National Presbyterian Church, and it's always great fun to see so many friends and familiar faces. As Quinn mentioned, I lead a group called the Trinity Forum, where we try to cultivate, curate, and disseminate the best of Christian thought. So I want to say at the outset, just to kind of acknowledge, I am not an original scholar, and a lot of the ideas that I'll be talking about today are not ones that I assiduously researched and then published. I have the incredible benefit of getting to interview several times a month some of the best speakers out there, best thinkers out there. And so a lot of what I'll talk with you about today is really a synthesis of the insights and wisdom that I had the blessing of receiving through talking to many people who dedicate their life to try to thinking deeply and wisely and faithfully about what matters most. And so I hope to kind of synthesize and reflect back some of that wisdom with you today. As I mentioned, we're going to talk about a few things: our context, our crises, and our hope. The context that we find ourselves in, which I'll talk about, the aftermath of the pandemic, our loneliness and atomization, our increasing secularism, as well as our increasing politicization, polarization, and tribalism, both outside the church and within it as well. The crises that lead us to, our epistemic crisis, I'll talk a bit about what I mean by that, our crisis of identity, our crises of authority, and then the hope that awaits us. And this is the part that I'm the most excited to talk about with you, and that I think when we kind of survey the sociological data, look at our context, we live in a world of hurt that is desperately in need of exactly what we as Christians have to offer: the good news. But a few caveats, just as I start. A lot of what I'm talking about is in an American context. This is not necessarily the case globally, and there's a lot of really exciting developments that are going on around the world, the way that Christianity Christianity is spreading in the global south and other places. So just want to caveat that. I'm talking largely about an American context, and I'm talking largely about the white church as well. Unfortunately, churches are often the most, in fact, segregated places. African American churches, a lot of this is not applied. There's a lot of really exciting things going on there. So again, just want to call that out. And also acknowledge that the circumstances will vary. A lot of this is in the aggregate, in the general, as opposed to being true in every particular. That said, what's the context that we find ourselves in? We are now emerging, thank goodness, from a pandemic that had, within the United States, over 103 million reported cases of COVID. Now, we know that probably the actual cases are far higher. There are lots of people like my brother and father who almost certainly had it because their entire family was infected with it. They had exactly the same symptoms, and they're like, why bother even going in? I know exactly what it is. So when you figure all those hidden cases, this was something that affected really all of us. We all either had it ourselves, had it several times, know people who had it, and the like. There are only over 1.1 million deaths from the pandemic. So we're coming out of, in many ways, a national trauma. And of course, that kind of trauma has tons of ripple effects. So alcohol-related deaths shot up over the last several years by some estimates as much as 25%. And of course, there's significantly increased anxiety and depression as a result of that, and particularly in young people. Now, presumably the pandemic is not the only reason for this. When you look at a lot of the data, anxiety and depression in young people totally just shot up starting around 2009, a slope of increase that was far higher. And a lot of people sort of trace that to 2009 being the year that the majority of young people had smartphones. And all of the different ways that affects their life as well. But it's fair to say that the pandemic does not help. When one is suddenly isolated, kind of atomized and available for connection only through the devices that have actually fueled a lot of the anxiety in the first place, that's a great recipe for increasing anxiety, increasing depression. And of course, the pandemic or isolation deepened a lot of the fissures that we already had. So zooming out to kind of look at some of those fissures, our context has changed significantly over the last generation. When I first came to DC as a 20-something, a recent college grad, one of my first bosses in DC was a guy named Pete Winger, who I know many of you know, who hired me in 2030, an organization called Empower America, which was a think tank at the time. And one of the things they did at the time, which I thought was, brilliant and quite elegant, is one of my bigger bosses, William Bennett, had released something called the Index of Leading Cultural Indicators, where he basically helped quantify what had been an increasing sense of unease about the way things were going. And he looked at different statistics that kind of measured what was happening within the country. And when you looked at those statistics in the aggregate, a very interesting as well as unsettling picture had emerged. This was in the early 1990s. You saw that murders had doubled, basically, from like the early 1960s to the early 1990s. The aggravated assault rate, probably the better measure of what the state of violent crime actually was in the country, just because medical technology had improved so much, had quadrupled. The divorce rate had doubled. The welfare rate had gone way up. The amount of time people spent watching TV rather than interacting with educational achievement had gone down. So basically, like in the aggregate, this show was painted a picture of a country that had become increasingly violent, increasingly lethal, increasingly angry, and with people increasingly at war with each other. Fast forward a generation, and you do a new index of leading cultural indicators now, you see a very different picture. And I want to say at the outset, there's many reasons for celebration and even abortions have actually gone way down. We don't think about that, but abortions in the country have really decreased. In many And while the trends show that we were, thank goodness, less violent, less prone to abortions and divorces and those kind of things, lonelier, far more disconnected, far more depressed, indebted, unhealthy, obese, addicted to our phones. Our crises have shifted, our problems have shifted from that of violent conflict to disconnection, withdrawal, and depression. And this showed up in a whole variety of ways. One, we were far less connected to institutions, to community groups, to churches. I'll talk more about that in a minute. The ways, the kind of institutions that kind of bonded us together. Because usually organizations, institutions are the trellis on which a vine of community can grow. Our allegiance, our membership to that has significantly decreased. We had far less trust in the institutions that we had once belonged to. Even institutions that we were only somewhat involved with, whether it was government, the church, law, academia, journalism, leaders in general, and we tended to withdraw. That trend was perhaps the most pronounced within churches. Right now, around 3/4 of senior citizens in our country identify as Christians. But for those under 30, only around half do. The largest religious shift in the last decade has been those described as the nuns, not the N-U-N-S, but the N-O-N-E-S. That is, those people who claim no religious affiliation at all. And in sharp contrast to much of the world where Christianity is growing, such as Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, China, and so on, in the United States, it's significantly declining. We're far less likely to be involved with churches or even to sort of claim the affiliation and the association of our faith. Not surprisingly, as we have grown less connected to different institutions, we've grown less connected to each other as well. As that trellis of different community institutions has kind of disintegrated, the vine of community has withered as well. And there's a lot of reports that the bonds between people are fewer and weaker. The number of friendships, those friendships that we report having in the aggregate, has declined. And an almost unprecedented number of Americans have reported having no close friends at all. Not surprisingly, and as per usual, it is often the most vulnerable and the most vulnerable communities that are the hardest hit. It's not usually the folks who go to National Presbyterian Church. It's the small communities that face lots of economic problems, where these trends are the most pronounced. So taken in the aggregate, just looking at that broad survey of trends, it's not that hard to see some crises that affect us. Perhaps crisis is a wrong word. I don't want to add to all the fear-mongering, but I think we can say that it's serious, and the implications are pretty serious as well. So one that I'll mention, which I think is something we probably feel almost every day, is the crisis of polarization. And part of what's happened is as our connections to institutions have broken down, as our bonds with each other have frayed, as our number of close friendships have grown fewer, we are social people, social animals, and we've gone looking for community. And increasingly, where we have looked, and particularly during the time of a pandemic where we are not supposed to be near each other physically, is online. And so our time online in the aggregate has gone way up. And often, the kind of community online that is most easily and quickly cultivated is not that of a group of people who agree on something passionately, but a group of people who share not a common love, but a common grievance, and get really fired up about it. It's a lot harder. Any of you who have worked in politics for any time know that it's pretty hard to get a lot of people really excited about something they support. Just because there's so many variations on that, people usually have slightly different ideas of what the best is or how it's
implemented. It's just hard to get a group together like that.
It's really easy to get a group united over something they dislike or hate. Don't have to be nearly as specific. And so one of the things that sociologists have observed in the last few years is a phenomenon of what they call affective polarization. That is tribes, and particularly online tribes, who are bound together not by a shared agreement or a shared love, but united by shared opposition, whether it's to a person or a party or an idea or what have you. So increasingly, and the pandemic has been something that really accelerated this, our communities and our tribes are online, built around shared hostilities. And so not surprisingly, partisan politics and those kind of online belonging has become a bigger part of what we think about what it means to belong, and a bigger part of our own sense of identity. Just one little factoid to kind of illustrate this. It used to be quite normal to marry someone outside of your party, but not outside of your faith. It used to be that marrying someone within your faith was very important and very common. Marrying someone outside the party, whatever, who cares? That has actually flipped. It is now, Americans are now twice as likely to marry outside of their faith than outside of their party. In the past, political scientists, sociologists, etc., considered religion and ethnicity and even gender to be the bedrock forms of identity, what they call the unmoved movers, what would often affect other parts of your sense of identity. But there was a recent NYU study that found that a growing number of Americans are actually willing to shift their religious, ethnic, or other identities to align with the demographics of their political tribe. This is a new thing that is happening. Even the very word evangelicalism is having a bit of an identity crisis, in that increasingly, where it once designated a set of creedal beliefs, now it's increasingly a tribal term. And in fact, the people who kind of call themselves self-reported evangelicals increasingly have very little familiarity with whether it's Bebbington's quadrilateral or what the actual creedal elements are. And it's become much more aligned with basically pledging allegiance to a particular candidate or political party. Part of the impact of this is our search for identity and belonging and purpose in partisan politics is then reflected in the growing syncretism that we see that will baptize political ends with what seems like eternal significance. We are trying to get more of our sense of meaning and purpose out of political combat. So disagreements become a war of good versus evil, where the fate of the country or the culture lies in the balance. The compromise with the opposition becomes capitulation to evil. And in this way of thinking, heroism consists of crushing your enemies and their ideas, and virtue requires ever more determination and force in resisting such evil and ultimately triumphing. So where has all of that left us? We're now at a point where, by a number of different studies, more than 40% of Americans view their political opponents as evil. Nearly 20% of partisans on both sides of the aisle admit to, quote, thinking on occasion that the country would be better off if large numbers of the opposition died. Even more depressing, just to continue to ladle on the bad news, There was a recent study that was done by the American Enterprise Institute, which is a conservative think tank, which found that white evangelicals stood apart from other religious groups when asked about the potential for violent action. And more than 40% completely or somewhat agreed with the statement that, quote, if elected leaders will not protect America, the people must do so themselves, even if it requires taking violent actions. So on top of our crisis of disconnection and identity, there's another crisis that has grown out of this, and this might seem a little bit less intuitive. It's something what I call kind of our epistemic crisis, which is as we are living more of our lives online and getting more of our information online, our information streams and silos are becoming more radicalized, more apocalyptic, more kind of set off, and increasingly more angry. And we as a people are becoming both more confused, more angry, and also more gullible. Technology companies have gotten very, very good at keeping our attention. And they have found that one of the best ways to do that is through their constructions of algorithms that customize our information streams to that which usually confirms our opinions, provokes our outrage, or shows the worst of the other side, making us feel a little bit more virtuous as well as much smarter. And while this is great for what they call engagement, that is sort of keeping you on your devices, it's not so great at encouraging a broader sense of perspective, a sense of restraint, or cultivating compassion for others. And it also increasingly leaves us open to misinformation. And by virtually every metric, that's where we are. Falsehood dominates much of our social media. It reaches people far more quickly, it penetrates more deeply, it spreads far faster. There was this really interesting article in The Atlantic not long ago that found that misinformation on our social media usually spreads 6 times more quickly than accurate reports. There's something about us, we eat it up when it confirms our opinion. So it's become much more difficult when you get a steady diet of information that basically confirms your biases and shows you the worst of the other side, what's often called nut picking. It becomes much harder to differentiate between truth and reality and fantasy, and the like. All of this is a precondition for conspiracy theories, and sure enough, we've seen a lot of those spreading and people buying into them. And I wish I could say that evangelicals are immune from them, but we are not. That same AEI study found that around 27% of white evangelicals, again, distinguishing this from others, the most of any religious group, believed part or all of the widely debunked QAnon conspiracy theory, and also noted that evangelicals had been targeted for vaccine misinformation, in part because it was fertile ground. So part of the reason why I'll elevate this to the level of crisis is that, within a diverse republic, one of the big challenges is having to negotiate and navigate and live with each other across difference. One of the challenges, of course, to the Christian life is loving our neighbor with whom we are quite different and we really disagree. And on a civic level, a sense of pluralism has often helped in the past us kind of navigate that. The idea that we can have different ideas about, what is good or bad or better or worse, has provided a context for that. But in a context where we have fundamental disagreements about what's true or false, real or unreal, that's new territory. And that's going to be, I think, a real challenge in the future as we go into a future, each of us with a different sense of what's actually real. And lots of evidence or media reports to back it up, because we are getting our customized and siloed and ever more partisan information streams. Not surprisingly, all of this has also led to a third and related crisis, that of authority. Now, I mentioned a little bit earlier that there has been a withdrawal from a lot of institutions, and the two sort of institutions where trust has decreased the most are exactly what you would think, which is government and political leaders and the church. Now, I'm obviously more worried about what's going on in the church than even what's going on in government. But one of the really sad things is that part of the reason many people believe like why secularism is increasing is because some of those crises of authority we, the church, have brought upon ourselves. This Friday, I'm going to have the chance to talk with Russell Moore on one of Trinity Forum's online conversations. Some of you are probably familiar with Russell. He used to be the head of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which was part of the Southern Baptist Convention, and recently left the Southern Baptist Convention, is going to either a Presbyterian church now or an Anglican church. I'm forgetting which one. But part of the reason for his departure were big conflicts within that denomination over how instances of sexual abuse were handled. And one of the things that he has said, and I've heard many other people say as well, whether it's David French, who recently talked with about that, is when they talk with young people, rarely do young people say that the reason they have left the church or deconstructed is because after extensive study or thinking, they just decided that none of this was true, and they no longer believe it. That's not what they say at all. Often what they say is they came to the conclusion that the church didn't believe what the church taught, as opposed to them not believing it. And the sexual abuse scandals, it is hard to, I think, kind of overstate how much in some quarters that has undermined some of the authority of the church. And obviously it needs to be said that there are churches and ministries and organizations that have handled challenges like that heroically, wisely, promptly, at great cost to themselves. And unfortunately, there are others that have not. Just one kind of biographical note, I grew up in a somewhat fundy background, and my mom's side of the family deeply so. The church that my mother actually grew up in after she left, and within really the last 15 years or so, the pastor there, who was 56 at the time, he's now in prison, and had transported a 16-year-old across state lines in order to have sex with her. And then his defense for that, he was counseling her at the time, was that she had seduced him. And it takes a certain cultural context for the pastor, a 56-year-old pastor, to believe that that excuse will fly. And so often by the time it actually reaches the level of a crime, which is what this was, there is a culture that has preceded that has enabled and aided and abetted that and made it seem possible. And I think part of what we are seeing now is the aftermath of cultures like that within our church, that have allowed sexual abuse or other abuses of power. And of course, there's many different kinds of abuse of power besides the sexual one to flourish. So with all of that, that's a quick a quick visit through a lot of really grim stuff. And I'm happy to announce that that has come to an end. The road trip through pathology and dysfunction. But it feels kind of necessary to be like, what's the context? Where are we? And so with all of those challenges, with that road trip through Hades, what are reasons for hope and encouragement? And I should say at the outset that in some ways you can say we have been here before, in the sense that there have been lots of times when it looked like Christianity, the faith, was in a really bad way. G.K. Chesterton once said that at least 5 times throughout history, the faith has, in his appearance, in his words, by all appearance, gone to the dogs. And in each of the 5 cases, it was the dogs who died. And I think the reason for that, of course, is not because of our brilliance or our effective strategies, but because of the truth and the Word, who we worship. And I do think that in all of these difficulties and challenging crises, there's a number of really exciting opportunities that I want to kind of sort of end on. One, we have an opportunity to better develop a robust and biblical public theology, how to live as political beings within a political community, and how to connect our faith not only to certain issues, but to the fullness of our lives and our theological priorities. One of the most, well, I guess one more thing just to say about that, almost all the great reform movements started with a renewed Christian public theology, whether it was abolition, civil rights, labor and poverty reforms, anti-trafficking efforts, even debt reduction. Ultimately, the result of, in the words of Cornel West, treating justice as love expressed in public. I also think we have, as part of that, an important opportunity ahead of us to lead the way in reforming our understanding of politics as what Reinhold Niebuhr called proximate solutions to insoluble problems, as opposed to freighted with ultimate questions, which have to be directed towards the author of the answers. A far greater opportunity, I think, is even to revive our sense of identity as children of God, rather than as partisans, which necessarily involves recognizing our deep need for discipleship and Christian formation, what it means to actually walk in the way of Christ. And of course, one of the earliest terms for Christians was followers of the way. It wasn't just the ends toward which one aimed, it was the way one went about it. And as part of that, I think we have an incredible opportunity to offer love, friendship, and community. One of the perhaps upsides of having all of these crises sort of ladled on top of each other is we're now at a point where there is an acute felt need for friendship, for love, for community, for a listening ear, for someone to actually take time and come alongside someone and hear what they have to say and pray with them and just be there for them. Jesus described the summing up of the Gospels as loving God with all that you are, heart, mind, soul, and spirit, and loving your neighbor as yourself. And we are at a time where we are in a world of hurt, where friendships have broken down, community is fraying. A lot of our civic, political crises are actually, at their base, a crisis of connection and a failure of love, our failure to love each other. And this is kind of the opportunity that we have. There's, of course, our faith provides incredible riches in terms of understanding how to love others, what love is, what it looks like, what it means. St. Augustine defined virtue itself, the ordo morum, as the proper ordering of one's loves, loving people and things to the right degree and in the right way. St. Thomas Aquinas defined love as to will the good of the other, and then also specified it was as the other. It's pretty easy to love people who are very much like ourselves. Where you see like, oh, such brilliance, such kindness, such verve and wit and attractiveness. People who are very different than ourselves are harder to love often. But this is how Aquinas defined it: to will the good of the other as the other. It's a definition which points to practical application in our common life, not merely a feeling or kind of a benign predisposition towards others, but a practical working out in our neighborhoods and communities. So what would that kind of application look like? This is actually, I'll throw this out there, a great topic of discussion. If you're meeting others with brunch, This is the kind of thing that it'll look different in different places. And I want to throw it out there as a conversation starter. What would it look like in your own spheres of influence? But I'll throw out just a few to kind of get, to sort of preempt or to jumpstart that conversation that hopefully you all might be having later today. One, it can be as simple as getting to know our neighbors. This is increasingly rare. I didn't even mention this earlier, but part of the decline of friendship is we are increasingly, again, in the aggregate, less likely to know the people living right next door to us. Less likely to have like the kind of bonds you had once with your neighbors where you could run over there for a cup of flour or an egg if you'd run out while baking, or borrow a power tool or whatever it was. So a very simple place to start is just get to know the people in your immediate neighborhood. Secondly, and again, this seems so basic, but is increasingly short supply, is to actually listen to people. It's also the way we often grow wiser. Jonathan Haidt, who was not a person of faith, but someone who is brilliant, lots of insights, has written that we're often very good at seeing the flaws in other people's arguments, but not our own. And it's actually in learning to listen that we become far more open to seeing new perspectives. It's also a precondition to love. So in many ways, listening is the first step towards both a more loving life and a wiser one. A third thing I'll mention is to listen to our use of language, the words we use. They matter tremendously. One of the things that's often very unsettling is, in a lot of political debates, you listen long enough and you start to hear people refer to their supposed opponents with terms that are dehumanizing. Whether it's referring to them as evil and stupid, or as insects or beasts, or some form of contagion, or an invasion or infestation. There's the language of dehumanization that undergirds and fuels and accelerates a lot of our conflict. And so just pay attention to the terms that we actually use to describe other people, and especially people that we disagree with or dislike. In many ways, I think we have an extraordinary opportunity for hospitality. It is uncanny how often the Bible mentions hospitality over and over again, about extending love and care to strangers, caring for the foreigner among you, basically to extend yourself on behalf of others. And in many ways, hospitality is so precisely what people are hungry for: to be welcomed in to someone else's life, to have an opportunity to talk, to be heard, to share ideas, to be welcomed. The lack of this is part of what's behind, the fact that so many of us are reporting fewer friendships and lonelier lives. It's part of what's driving people online. We all know that a conversation face-to-face is so different than an exchange online. There's just far more depth to it. There's more creativity to it. There's the potential for it to go in so many different directions. The amount of information you can get just from looking in someone's face as you talk with them is different than when it's mediated by a screen. So extending that kind of hospitality. And lastly, I'll throw out creating things together can be so vital and important. And again, this reflects not just the biblical call to hospitality, the biblical call to love, but also the way we were made to be created in the image of God, who himself was the creator. A friend of mine, a guy named David Bailey, who heads up Arabon Industries in Richmond, which is a reconciliation ministry. And they have found that the best way to bring about reconciliation between neighborhoods or neighbors who are divided by whatever it is, by politics, by race, by something else, is to make something together. That there is something about being engaged in a common creative endeavor that breaks down certain walls and just opens up new opportunities for relationship. Now, obviously, this is work for the long haul. It's usually much easier to slide into crisis quickly than to get out of it. But what I wanted to kind of leave everyone with is that part of our opportunity is that the crises we face right now, the loss of connection, the loss of truth, the failure of love, are all found in returning to the ways of Jesus, who offers love and truth and connection and tells us that he will never leave us. And so the way forward can be found in returning to and embodying and living out those ways, which were embodied, which were personal, which were often slow, and were deliberate. It also means turning from what the paradigm that has dominated so much of Christian talk about our common life together, from the domination of politics to discipleship, to the focus on formation, focus on our embodied practices, our habits that shape our experience and our perspectives. And instead of imposing our way, the domination paradigm of politics, following the way. So in a world where so much of what ails us is our loss of connection, our alienation from each other, our anger, our loneliness, the good news is that that is precisely what we have to offer. A world of hurt who desperately need the love, the connection, the belonging that Christ offers us. And we have this great consolation. We know that love never fails, and it's exactly what our world needs. So I see we have about 10, 15 minutes left. So I would be happy to take questions, any questions there might be.
Cherie, thank you so much. Thank you for coming and being face to face with us today and bringing a message of hope. God bless you and thank you.
I don't have a question at the moment, but I just thought of an example of what you were speaking about how we treat people that we maybe dislike. I just read in the paper the other day about a man who was going through the drive-through at a restaurant, and he was taking too long to place his order, and the person behind him started honking their horn for a long time. So anyway, he responded by, when he went up to pay for his food, he paid for that person's food also.
That's brilliant.
Your message of hope is great, and what you're doing with Trinity Forum is really quite amazing. I wonder whether you see a tension, to use that phrase, between its start as a personal relationship, small group meetings, but you have conquered the world with your electronic vision and reach. Is there a tension between digital and person to person or not?
Oh, it's a great question, Bruce. And yes, there is a form of tension. It's very important to us. We're big believers in embodied communication. It's also undeniable that you reach far more people when you can have something over Zoom or the like. We started doing our online conversations when the pandemic hit. And before that had not done really anything online. And we had been wanting to do, we'd put our content online, but we thought we should probably add this on. But the pandemic basically meant it was mediated through a screen or not happening at all. As we are coming back, we're going to be keeping those, but also resuming a lot of in-person small group, reading groups, salons, and the like. And I don't know that there's an easy resolution to the tension, but I guess part of the way I think about it is like the online is a rolling out of a warm welcome as an introduction, to welcome people in, and then kind of going further and more deeply, is always best done face to face.
How about a plug for Friday's talk with the editor of Christian Today?
Oh, yes. Where did that come from? Oh, right. Okay, there you are. Sure, yes, I'm excited about it. So Russell is a friend. Russell is also a senior fellow of the Trinity Forum, and he has a new book that is coming out. It's either, I think it actually comes out July 18th, so that's Tuesday? Yeah, so coming out this week, which is entitled Losing Our Religion, an Altar Call for Evangelical America. So I think you'll probably hear some of the themes that even I've discussed today, which will be discussed in his book, and he'll be our guest this Friday.
Thank you. Could you give us maybe a little more detail from the Richmond example of how they did creative things within the community? Maybe some practical examples would be helpful.
Yeah. Well, one thing I'll say is apparently you're going to get a lot of that in just a couple of weeks when you all get to hear from David Bailey. So, I don't want to put words into his mouth, but his ministry called Arabon focuses largely on racial reconciliation in Richmond. And so part of what they do it's shared arts projects, shared beautification projects, essentially a shared creative work within the city that also has, that is accessible. So it could be an arts installation, it could be a mural, whatever it is, some kind of creative endeavor that people, from different points of view and different walks of life can work on together. And through it, not only create something together, but create relationships between each other. So I won't steal David's thunder. I'm sure he'll tell you more in just a couple weeks.
Cherie, thank you. I have more of a comment than a question. I had the opportunity recently to hear a talk from a woman who co-authored a book on Gen Z. And one thing that really struck me from the research they found is that counterintuitive to what we might think, Gen Z actually craves personal interaction with other people. And hearing your comment about why some of young people are pulling away from the church, we have an opportunity here. Fortunately, National has a very good youth and children's program and young people, college interaction. We should take the opportunity to interact with these young people and engage with them and talk with them more about Christ, because I think they would be very open to it.
Seems to me one of our basic problems is an inability to agree on basic facts. How big a role would you give to fact checkers? And how much energy should we devote to establishing facts? Or is that not the real problem in your view?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. But I think one of the things that undergirds that is really a lack of trust. In that you can have all the fact checkers lined up saying this is accurate, this is not, but if you don't even trust the fact checkers, all of those kind of efforts come to naught. And part of our challenge is that there's a crisis of trust, and people are essentially trusting only the folks or the authorities that kind of are already where they are. And so you already see that play out. There are different candidates and political figures and what have you who say all sorts of things that often demonstrably aren't true. It contradicts video from just a week before, but it doesn't seem to matter. It doesn't seem to penetrate. And that's because often whom we trust, or what we trust is made not on the basis of as much as we would like to think so, kind of rational, dispassionate study and application, ruthless application of logic. It's kind of like who we like and who we trust. And so there's kind of an emotional component to that. So I think fact checking certainly has its place and is valuable, but I think the bigger underlying issue is the fact that we are, our sense of trust in the trustworthy has really declined.
Have you found that there's Christian organizations or others that are making progress in articulating a vision for the kind of America we'd like rather than this dissension we currently have?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And, may their number increase. Certainly at the Trinity Forum, that's one of the things that's really important to us, where we, have talked a lot about trying to cultivate, curate, disseminate the best of Christian thought for the common good. It's not just to kind of think big, lofty thoughts, or be known as, deep thinkers. It's to to put those ideas in action. And so a lot of our senior fellows and others, I think, are doing really wonderful works. Two of our senior fellows, David French and Russell Moore, recently are launching, it's a curriculum for churches to help deal with the challenges of polarization within it. As an aside, one of the things that's been, really distressing, a lot of pastors are really just exhausted, discouraged, demoralized. There was a Barna study that showed that last year, 40% of pastors had seriously considered quitting within the last year, which was up from like 29% just like the year before. I think people are exhausted, and when you're in a church where people are constantly fighting with each other and the pastor is constantly trying to make peace, that gets exhausting after a while. So their curriculum kind of aims at that. Another one of our senior fellows, James K.A. Smith from Calvin. He's the editor-in-chief of Image magazine. And they are doing a lot with faith in the arts and the way that the arts can be kind of a path to a deeper, more contemplative tradition. Kurt Thompson, some of you might know, who is local and has a group called Being Known. He's a psychiatrist and is doing a lot of work there on the kind of intersection between faith, our spirituality, and neurobiology. That is what happens, where we put our attention actually has huge implications for our life. Like, there's a lot of evidence that shows that the biblical injunction about the renewing of your mind is actually a far more literal reality than many of us had believed. Like, where we put our attention, where we dwell, actually affects the formation or the pathways, our neural pathways. And so things we do repeatedly become much easier to do again. So there's all sorts of, I think, work going on, both on kind of an intellectual or theoretical level, as well as just like the nitty-gritty practical level. And, let 1,000 flowers bloom, or as that goes.